Hi, and welcome to Healing Solidarity, the conference about reimagining international development. I'm Marianne Clements, initiator of this conference, writer and consultant, and facilitator of the Replenishment Room. And in this conversation, I'm talking with Lisa VeneKlasen, founder and director of JAS. In our conversation, we talk about their work with grassroots activists around the world and the ways in which both Lisa and I feel that the cultures of international NGOs and the ways in which they work need to change. I was excited to hear both more about the approaches JAS use and also how they might inspire us to all do things differently. And I hope that you will enjoy this conversation too. So welcome, Lisa. And I wanted to start by asking about the work you do with JAS.
So JAS is a multi-regional network that is really focused on equipping grassroots women activists and supporting social movements. So we're working with NGOs, but really on the edges of NGOs with many of the activists that are on the margins of that. And so it's a long-term accompaniment process that includes all aspects of what is known as empowerment, but really collective empowerment. And over many years, because we work in difficult contexts, the countries that we're most deeply involved in are Cambodia, Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, Zimbabwe, Myanmar, among others, are what we call hostile contexts, and they have been for many, many years. And for women, not new. The closing of civic space is not new for women, So the movement building work is really about building a sense of solidarity at the core of organizing and movement building work. And a key piece of that is enabling women to be safer together. So basically that's what we do. So we work with a whole range of women human rights defenders globally. Because of the work over the last 12 years, we are doing a lot of advocacy and participation in bigger conversations about how to understand the closing civic space and how to understand violence against defenders from the perspective of women activists and the gender of that, and from the perspective of movements.
I want to just ask you, where did the idea for Just Associates come from? Was it through a need that you saw? I'm sure it was, but what was the need you saw? How did the idea come about?
So originally JAS was Just Associates, and really like a sort of play on words. We were just associates.
Okay.
We were a global community of practice of activists, researchers, advocates. Many of us come from old school popular education and community organizing with movements, including liberation movements. So we were very aggressively a community of practice and did not want to get any external funding. So we generated through fee-for-service, through training to other bigger organizations on the issues of rights-based development. That was the kind of the era in the 90s. And but in 2005, we came together. We were men and women at that time. And we came together to do a kind of mapping of the different contexts in which we found ourselves, and agreed that backlash against women's rights, women speaking out, women activists, this was 2005, was destroying and beginning to reverse really important gains in the roles and voices of women on a whole broad range of things. So we completely began a reorganization in 2006, a vision called Imagining and Building Women's Movements of the Future. And we, building on the relationships and histories of our founding community of practice in
Mhm.
Mesoamerica, Southern Africa, and Southeast Asia. We began to build Jazz as we began a process of equipping activists to be strong and safe collectively in the face of backlash. Now, obviously, fast forward 2018,
Yeah.
and the new level and degree of violence, you know, with sort of patriarchy on steroids and capitalism on steroids, you know, this work is really, really important. And, you know, there is no way that relying on states and security systems are going to enable women to be loud and safe.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
it is us, and it is our many allies who are organizations and mixed organizations, not exclusively. So Jazz doesn't only work with feminist organizations. We are feminists. We do this work from a feminist perspective, but we work very much with mixed organizations and with women in movements that are not women's rights movements, generally speaking.
Okay. So you're supporting activists individually as well as collectively to
Yeah.
make them.
And actually, we feel like you can't separate the two.
Yeah.
For political organizing and I mean, our goal is really at this stage is to really build the capacity to ensure that women leaders, women activists,
Mm-hmm.
Feminist perspectives are at the heart of broader social justice, environmental movements. That is our mission. So.
And so when you think about international development, which I guess is a sort of like, you could say it was aligned with some of that, and some of it not so much, right? And all the talk in the sector around women's rights that is there, you know, even amongst quite mainstream organizations. Like, what from the perspective of your work would you say like needs to shift collectively in that space in terms of how we address women and power, basically? Massive question.
It's a huge question. I mean, it's interesting because originally, when we were a community of practice, we worked a lot with some of the big international development organizations to really strengthen their practice. Initially, it was around participatory development, citizen participation. Then it was on rights-based development, and as part of that, on gender and women. And that was basically from 2001 to 2006. And Oxfam and Action Aid and you know, a whole Plan International, a number of very important big international development organizations. You know, one of the reasons that we did not want to create an international NGO ourselves was what we were observing with the sector.
Yeah.
We were working all the way in the weeds with the sector. And what we saw is gradually shifting away from community development and community participation to a logic that was really around campaigning and fundraising and policy advocacy at a very high level. And so we saw a disconnect between the policy work and the campaigning and the kinds of grassroots development and constituency building that had been so important in an earlier moment in organizations. It's not that these things were abandoned, but institutionally you could see the logic shifting. And, you know, there are no simple sort of this is bad and this is good. It's, you know, people have described it as NGOization. There's some advantage to be able to be a player, to have, you know, Bono and 6 Oxfam and 1 activist be able to sit down with the World Bank president. There's value in that.
Yeah.
But when that becomes the driving interest of the organization, and at no point unless it's sort of in an instrumentalized way, do those community representatives come to the table? That's when the logic shifts dramatically. And I think, you know, the reckoning around First and scandal, around, you know, the diamond, and the abuse within the organization, and then, you know, more recently, or sort of simultaneously, Save the Children, and then we have stories in the UN. The institutions at no point are dealing with the power structures internally that they are seeking to engage in externally. And increasingly over the last 10 years, these have become corporate actors in every sense, including ways of raising money, engaging with the corporate sector in so many different ways. And the logic and the interests are around really being at the center of power. Again, that is really important work when the mission remains, but it's very easy to lose track. I mean, with so much dependence on bilateral aid, on the one hand, these are servicing bilateral aid in the corporate sector.
Yeah.
And at what point do you reconcile the interests of you as a contractor to governments?
Yeah.
And you as a player with Citigroup and BP, how are you reconciling that with indigenous and rural communities that are defending land and territory against corrupt mining deals? It becomes unreconcilable. So
absolutely,
there's a bit of there are places in the institution that it's broken. Yeah. There's a broken, and I think the recent scandals there are so many good quality people in these institutions who come from such amazing experience and expertise, and really do have the experience to make a difference in people's lives. But there's been a kind of collective rediscovery that actually change happens in people's lives on the ground.
Yeah.
And so a shift in the sector, but the logic of sort of interests, corporate player, and being a player sits in contradiction to that. And so when you hear the stories of you know, Oxfam and Save the Children, there is a part of international development sector that is very, the word I read recently in a New York Times piece was adrenalized.
Mm-hmm.
And it's what a friend of mine and I always refer to as the cowboys.
The cowboys. Yeah.
I mean, we're here, we're solving your problem. We don't need to listen to you.
Yeah.
Got it covered. Get in line. And there's something about that begins to shape the whole culture of the organization, which is, we are the experts. We're going to solve this. We've got evidence. We've got connects. And we're going to let you talk for 2 minutes, and then we're going to get on with the business of it. So at what point do you actually question your relationship to the people who are meant to benefit from change?
Yeah.
And that you really question the whole logic of your organization. So you're not like solving problems for poor folk.
Yeah.
But really figuring out how you use these giant players, the resources and the influence they have, at the service of change in a very different way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think that really resonates with me, and I think about the latest news about the Save the Children thing was about how much money they'd spent on lawyers trying to stop some of the stories come out with. Just that feels like the kind of real antithesis of the theoretical aim of an organization that was supposed to be invested in women's rights. And you know, it just I mean, it's kind of obvious and plain for everyone to see that that doesn't add up at all. So I just wonder how, like, is it whether it's even possible to unpick some of that? And I tend to look at things like what you do as, albeit on a different scale, but alternative approaches in many ways to how we can help people to build power in a way that isn't, you know, like I'm the cowboy, you know, to use your example.
I mean, it's you know, we are in a global reckoning moment that I think, you know, the election of Trump really, and Brexit and things in the global north and the rise of the right and the rise of fascists and even openly white supremacists in the US has caused a reckoning among all of us about what it means to walk the talk. You know, what it means to, you know, what is white privilege, what is gender privilege and male privilege. That is opened up a conversation that I have never seen in my lifetime. I've done very, you know, early on, my initial work was with the Sandinista government in the context, or actually in the early years of the revolution, in the early years of that liberation project. So radical change and very powerful progressive ideas. These aren't new to me. I've never seen it open up in a deep personal way as it has in the global north. And I think that's trickling into the sector in a really, really important way. I mean, #MeToo stands on decades of work by women, decades working to, you know, stop harassment, name harassment, stop sexual harassment. And yes, it is a hashtag that then takes all that organizing and mobilizing to a different moment. I think we come at this we came at this challenge of equality from a different perspective, in that rather than say, what does research on the issues tell us about what to do on the ground? We are old-fashioned community organizers and popular educators. So our starting point and our measure of success, and that is central to all of our strategies, our starting point and measure of success is the women and the contexts in which we are. And the power dynamics that play around, that are at play in creating inequality and violence. And so over time, in building women's perspectives of what they're experiencing and their priority problems, we explore as a network, what can we bring from the network in terms of information, in terms of door opening, and in terms of skills that will build over time and build bridges and connections. So it's a very different starting point. So today, you know, 12 years in, we've been part of building things like the Mesoamerica Women Human Rights Defense Initiative, which is starting point is the violence that women defenders, ranging from indigenous women to journalists, are experiencing in the region. And building from there to develop, you know, a database and track information and develop systems of solidarity and urgent action that women are controlling and shaping. So it's a totally different model. It comes from, rather than what can we do to save you, it comes from we are saving ourselves every day, and collectively we and it's not easy because, you know, to sustain ourselves as an organization, or even, you know, any of the initiatives that we've been involved in, you have to engage with the logic of a donor world. that wants policy change as a measure of success, even in the same breath as they say governments are useless. You're like, okay, well, which is it? So, and where you're working with governments where the human rights piece is in direct contradiction to the security strategies, to the trade strategies. And so you're navigating the logic and demands of resources and trying to protect the organizing on the ground from that. I'm not sure we can, I feel like that is an unresolved tension. Even as jazz gets bigger and stronger, the tension between the logic of money and influence and the pace and the dynamics and the demands and that of organizing and change on the ground and real safety and collective power, there's a lot of tension there.
And does that tension mostly kind of stem from how you get resources? Or is there more to it? I guess power as well.
It's power. It's how you get what comes with the demands that come with the resources.
Yeah.
That require a heavy investment of specialization and capacity that easily smothers what is community organizing, leadership, and movement building. You know, movement building is not institutionalized, yet it is really important that there are support NGOs all along the way. The balancing of your own agenda as an NGO in sustaining yourself and the accompaniment is not a simple one. It's not simple.
No.
So, yeah, we're trying something. We're trying, and we are a hybrid of many, many things. And we shift directions and we course correct because 40% of what we do in any given year is not in the plan.
Okay.
We really are agile. But it's, you know, we have some amazing donors with giant love for us who give us a wide, you know, a lot of room to maneuver. So yeah, I think it's, you know, I think in terms of international development, I think there are a number of people who are in rethink mode. Yeah. And there are a number of things that are causing and the rethink. Everything from the scandal and #MeToo to the closing of civic space, meaning the restrictions on the movement of money and international organizations, and the demonizing of some international organizations in some contexts. So it's a real rethink on what did we do wrong and what's wrong with human rights and what's wrong with development. And it seems to me that the answer to that really is, how do we rebuild around a deep sense of solidarity that is about respecting, responding, and shaping, you know, what is happening in all of the different countries that we are located in. So it means moving resources and power very, very differently.
Yeah. I think that I really think that rethink is, well, I hope it's part of what I'm trying to contribute to with these conversations, I think. And I just wanted to go back to something you said. If 40% of what you do is not planned, I think that's interesting because we are so obsessed, you know, generally in the sector, not you and I particularly, but with, you know, the plan, the budget, the strategy, the sort of thing that's worked out and what's going to come out at the end of it. And if we could relax into the idea that 40% of what we do will be emergent, I guess, that's a significant shift in itself, right?
It is. I mean, I think it demands a higher level of clarity about mission,
Mm-hmm.
principles,
Mm-hmm.
and ethics.
Yeah.
You know, and I think when you become these giant corporate actors, you know, with all the possibilities and downside of that, what happens is you become depoliticized. You stop engaging with equality and development as a thing of class, gender, race, and power. And your politics become more how you engage in policy and how you play the game, and not about whose side are we on and how do we take on the, you know, and challenge the most blatant destructive forms of capitalism
Mm.
that is destroyed. And if you're not working on that, what are you working on? I mean, I think for me, what was curious is that the international development sector didn't have a crisis after the 2008 financial collapse. Because to me, it was sort of like, you all have been working on equality for 30 years. You don't have an alternative here? And you've been with banks and governments. Where's the response? You know, there was an opportunity to change the conversation. And, you know, it came from groups like Occupy and, you know, other efforts in Spain and around the world, but were not sustained enough. So it's really about, how do we understand power right now? And how do we understand the deepest, most destructive parts of inequality and violence? And that happens to, you have to understand the drivers of capitalism and patriarchy very, very clearly. And with that, you really have to understand racism as a factor. And if we're not developing strategies with that deep intersectional understanding, we're not making change. And it's, you know, it's interesting because you meet with country programs in big international organizations, and you meet with monitoring and learning and strategists and program people, and they are so creative and thoughtful, but they're working in institutions that have completely that aren't holding the culture of challenging power at the center of what they do and who they are. And, you know, you going full circle to the crisis in the sector around the scandals and internal harassment and abuse and etc. You know, unless you really change the culture and how we see ourselves, and that means changing who we are and being comfortable to be able to step into something that maybe we didn't know, then we're not going to be able to contribute to a major, major shift. So it is really about changing who we are, but from a place of much sharper politics. Much sharper.
I love that, because I think it's so easy, I think, for people to, in the sector, to fall into this idea that they are somehow creating change as something you do to other people. And, you know, that's where the project plan and all of that, you're going to sort of do this thing and be of service in some way, but you're almost not involved. You're just a sort of, you know, almost a deep, as you said, it's completely depoliticized. You're just a sort of agent of something.
Yeah.
And I think when we bring ourselves in and ask questions of ourselves, that for me, that's where, like, oh, the light bulbs go on. Like, how am I perpetuating these structures through the way that I'm working on the things that I'm doing that I might have not thought about in that way before?
Yeah, I think it's huge, and you know, it's very much hard of how jazz works and why our partners in the communities where we are actually really value the distinction of jazz and the sense of belonging and humility that we create. It's, anybody in the organization, including me, and I'm bringing out loads of this identity is so heavy to carry into the room. And we'll just add to that positional power of being the ED from the global North white woman.
Yeah.
Wow. It's really how you become part of the change in yourself, and how each one of us in jazz as popular educators, we are facilitators and we're shaping things and strategizing and bringing ideas, but it's very much from what can I learn here that will help me also change and be with you. And people recognize that, we are very connected interpersonally, and I think it's very much a feminist way of doing things. That it may be that I have many privileges as a white woman with living in the US now and given my class and all of that, but there is so much about me that is crippled by sexism and my own story and my own pain. I can relate so much to other women who may be in a very different situation. And that is really key to building much more powerful movements, and also key to the trust that we develop with organizations as jazz. And that, it's coming from a very different place.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because over the journey, we are now at the point, where the women that we've accompanied, for example, in Malawi, who are now this 8,000 strong, HIV positive led Our Bodies, Our Lives campaign that has actually helped shift the ARV treatment and has hubs, and they're engaging with the hospitals. They write to me and they're like, when are we going to talk to GlaxoSmithKline? You can help us talk to Glaxo. So they're coming to me like, you should know, you should be able to help us get to GlaxoSmithKline. Now your role has changed. We want you to help us on this one. And I think that is it. You shift over time from where you're, maybe helping to lead and catalyze, but then you as an old friend of mine said, then pretty soon you're walking alongside, and pretty soon you're walking behind, and they're saying, do this for us, please. This is what we need from you. So for example, now I think our allies in Mesoamerica, they want us to engage much more with US policy. They want us to be present and accompany those processes, but if you're a global network and you're not doing that work, you're not doing enough for us. And with us, that is the solidarity we need from you. Yeah. So it's changing roles over time in difficult contexts. And so it goes back to your 40% question about, what happens. But think of this year, we start the year with a whole set of plans in Mesoamerica, fraudulent elections in Honduras, complete explosion of mobilization and violence, and then Nicaragua. And so what's in your plan? You have to keep moving your plan, but you're accompanying groups that your role is shifting. And so you're providing strategy in different ways. And so in this movement moment where there's a lot of mobilization everywhere, we've shifted, we have these sustained workshops, schools, and that model of training, but we have something that is called Escuela Viva, which goes right into the heart of the action, is a short-term strategy and leadership process. So shifting how you work and what you're offering to the context, rather than saying, well, we had this plan, we've got to follow through with the plan.
Yeah, we studied the context and now we've got a plan and that's the end of it. It doesn't shift and change. Yeah, I think that's so wise, truly. that even that cultural understanding of that change is important, that flexibility and agility is important. I think even if it doesn't always, perfectly, happen as it might, the cultural understanding that that's possible and not problematic feels huge. I think in many would feel huge in many organizations where it's like, well, you didn't do what you said.
I mean, it is, we try to put at the center of our conversations with our donor partners, many of whom really value this, that this is the nature of our work, and when you respond to context, this is what happens. And at the same time, there's more increasing pressure on us. Will demonstrate to us the impact of your work over time, which I think is a valid question. It is a valid question that, what are you doing and what does that accompaniment do? What is changing? And not just what is changing from the perspective of policy. I mean, I think it's really interesting that very few of us talk about the fact that in 2018, the leadership of many social movements is female. Okay, there's some impact. Yes, we are barely holding the line on women's rights gains achieved decades ago. But look at the leadership and look at the models of organizing in the global north and the global south. And it is women. And, even in the context of the World Cup, who took the political action to throw onto the field to get a dress, to challenge the Russian government, the Pussy Riot? And it almost didn't get coverage. Yeah. So, yeah. Women are at the forefront on many, many, many issues. So it's not like we're asking for it. We're at the forefront of environmental issues, of corruption issues, of violence issues. And it's really critical that our male friends understand and work alongside women and understand the different ways of organizing. And so that is going to be a culture shift in our organizations as well.
Yeah. I find that inspiring to think that we could make that kind of shift. And I also think that examples like what you're doing might well be the future. Not just your, but examples of doing things differently might have to come up, is what I mean. And because I think shifting as well is challenging.
Although sometimes I dream of appealing to the big international organizations to ask them to create a special SWAT team.
Mm-hmm.
SWAT team that helps open doors with policy influencers and media influencers and resources to keep this kind of work going and not to keep their own power going.
Yeah.
So that, we of course, I think there's an enormous amount of conversation to be had. I feel like the opportunity to change those and the kind of spirit of rethink, those windows close pretty quickly. So I'm really hoping that we get some things on the table that can shift practice.
Yeah. I love your SWAT team idea. So if anyone's watching this who knows how to create a SWAT team.
SWAT team of policy influencers, media influencers, and their job is to make women and the organizing visible, powerful, and resourced.
And that's the actual work that's going on the ground, not creating an opportunity from something. Yeah.
Not creating some sort of campaign that has a whole bunch of resources, let's make poverty history, or that doesn't land, that doesn't I think landing and change in people's lives and communities is what everyone wants now. They want to see change. They want to be part of change.
Yeah.
And, you know, I think there's a whole new generation that is just so ready for a new kind of global solidarity and a new way of thinking about, you know, liberation, and a new way of thinking about all the many roles we play as citizens, consumers, humans, in our family, on social media, and in our communities. And so the opportunity is there.
Yeah, there's massive opportunity, isn't there, in what we have, the ways we're connected now.
So much opportunity, you know.
Yeah.
At the same time, I always say, you know, it is a movement moment, but to remind us that hashtags are mobilizations, and real change is around organizing and building infrastructure ecosystems of people that are connected, and organizations that are aligned, and agendas that merge. And that is a lot of rolling up the sleeves and political conversation and safe space to come together and to build power together.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lisa, for this conversation. I really enjoyed it. So thanks for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you. Thanks for your questions and the chance to talk about this stuff.
You're welcome. You've been listening to me, Marianne Clements, in conversation with Lisa VeneKlasen, and this is the Healing Solidarity Conference. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you'd like to spend a bit more time with the ideas and suggestions that we discussed in this talk, or any of the others in the Healing Solidarity Conference, don't forget you can make a contribution to support the production of this conference and get access to recordings and ongoing conversations about these themes and ideas. Just click the link below this video to find out more. Thank you.